Good afternoon to everyone joining us in the USA, and good evening to all those tuning in from Europe. ومساء الخير والورد والفول للكل المستمعين في الشرق الأوسط. Let me know if you can't hear me. And welcome to this MEI Zoom conference event, Imagining Future Air Wars, what Turkish successes in Nagorno-Karabakh and Libya might foreshadow for mid-21st century aerial conflict elsewhere. It's my great pleasure to be welcoming you to this special panel, which incidentally derives from my recent MEI publication, Turning the Tide, How Turkey Won the War for Tripoli, co-authored with our first speaker, Colonel Wolfgang Pusztai. My sincere thanks go again to Wolfgang for extracting from our study of the Libyan battle space a slew of novel phenomenon that highlight the ways in which Libya was a leading indicator for developments elsewhere. Or in my favorite Aristotle quote, which I love to overuse, Libya is always bringing forth something new. So it was in the 4th century BC, and so it remains as relates to drone warfare, novel hybrid anti-aircraft systems, and new ways to jam Pantsir missile defense systems. Now, to kick off things, I'll do my best attempt for the next few minutes introducing the phenomenon under study before turning things over to the panel. So what's the phenomenon under study? Briefly put, a fairly new form of extraterritorial war was fought over Libya's skies from April 2019 to June 2020. And the likely winner couldn't have been predicted by analysts before the conflict started. The tide of the war actually shifted abruptly as the LNA side, with Emirati, Egyptian, and Russian aerial support, initially had aerial dominance from April 2019 to November. And then abruptly, starting in January 2020, the Turkish-supported GNA side achieved complete aerial supremacy. And it was this component which proved decisive to the overall outcome of the war. Now, what do I mean when I say it was an extraterritorial war? This means that Turkey fought the UAE over Libyan airspace, but the Libyan actors on both sides weren't proxies. They weren't supported. They didn't really do the aerial fighting. It was truly extraterritorial actors fighting. So the key lessons that were uncovered from looking at this novel form of war impacts various vectors. Let me quickly summarize only 5 of the most salient points. 1, due to changing geopolitical factors and the decrease in NATO coherence, or as well as the American hegemon's willingness to act militarily abroad, it seems that medium powers can escalate their military interventions while still remaining under the threshold of an intervention that would cause major powers to themselves intervene. Issue 2, I'd like to introduce the concept of casualty aversion, which our research postulates is linked to the determinative dimension of aerial supremacy. This means that in conflicts that do not exhibit casualty aversion, like say Yemen and Syria, where both sides' military forces are willing to take major casualties and maintain the will to fight, aerial supremacy may not be as determinative of the conflict's final outcome as in military theaters like Nagorno-Karabakh or Libya, where casualty aversion, as exhibited on both sides' militaries and their supporting civilian populations, has meant that once aerial supremacy is achieved over the relevant locations like roads, bridges, ports, and airstrips, that then the opponent's troops tend to withdraw and the civilians submit. Issue 3, there are other more strategic lessons, like how drones and new anti-aircraft and counter-anti-aircraft technologies allow what would otherwise be thought of as these medium powers to achieve the aerial supremacy that was usually only ever achieved by major powers. Now, point 4 is connected to point 1, namely how the current state of global affairs allows for these medium powers to fight each other extraterritorially over other people's airspace without the superpowers or major powers intervening, or the citizens of the country which is being extraterritorially fought over being able to actually affect the flow of battle. Or lesson 5, how this new form of warfare is part of a larger continuum of developments that theorists of insurgency, counterinsurgency, and low-intensity conflict, such as the famous Martin van Creveld, have been writing about and warning about for decades. how the military superiority of the major superpowers is being eviscerated as less technologically advanced powers who have either a greater willingness to fight, kill, or transgress international norms, or a greater willingness to take and inflict casualties, are also being aided by technological change that progressively levels the playing field and globalizes the technological edge, which used to be monopolized only by the superpowers. In short, there are many, many major lessons that can be drawn from the paper, and even a half hour would not be sufficient to discuss these. Hence, to further narrow the focus of our discussion, rather than introduce more lessons, I'd like to break down this otherwise amorphous basket into three distinct levels of engagement. One, what the paper says about politics and military conflict in Libya, how it has gotten to where it is now, and where it's likely to be headed given the balance of forces and capabilities and involvements and interests of the various external players. This is actually the dimension that we spoke about in our November 23, 2020, Unleashing a New Way of Warfare, how Turkey's drones and air defense systems won the war for Tripoli. That was a Zoom event which you can find on the MEI website, and the comms team will share with the attendees the link to that. So we're not going to be focusing on that level today. Then level two, what the lessons from the paper say about the technical and mechanical progress of drone and anti-aircraft, as well as counter anti-aircraft warfare, and how these technologies are likely to further develop and progress and to affect military doctrines of different powers. This is a fascinating and technical topic, but as this panel is aimed at a non-military audience, this will only be briefly touched upon. So that leaves us the third level of analysis, i.e. what we actually will be focusing on today. So what are the events that transpired over Libya's skies from April 2019 to June 2020 actually tell us about other conflicts globally? How can they help us understand how the regional balance of power has changed and what the technical innovations which were unveiled over Libya's skies are likely to play out elsewhere? And how did they in fact play out over Nagorno-Karabakh, which was a major conflict that transpired only a few short months after the Libya conflict's conclusion and brought to bear all of the salient points that we're mentioning? Joining me to delve into this strategic, geopolitical, and comparative vector and look at the various case studies are my respected colleagues from a range of relevant fields who are bringing to bear a variety of military and civilian backgrounds. Firstly, we will hear from my co-author, Colonel Wolfgang Pusztai. He brings to bear vast military experience from a range of positions within the Austrian Ministry of Defense and General Staff, as well as several international assignments with the EU and NATO. He's also worked for a long time in the intelligence business and has over a decade of experience working on Libya and the larger Eastern Mediterranean region. He'll introduce us quickly to some of the technical developments and innovations he spotted in the aerial component of the war for Tripoli and how they were mirrored or built upon in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, all the while sharing with us his lessons that drone powers can draw from these conflicts on the strategic, tactical, and operational levels. He will extrapolate outward. What does this say about lessons for other ongoing conflicts? He'll touch on ways that the EU, US, and others can try to counter the drone threat and what we might be likely to see in future conflicts. Secondly, we'll hear from Lieutenant General Michael Nagata. He's recently retired from the US Army in 2019 with 34 years of US Special Operations experience. So we're very honored for his contribution. His final position in the service was as Director of Strategy for the National Counterterrorism Center from 2016 to 2019. He's my colleague at MEI, where he occupies the Distinguished Senior Fellow on National Security position. The General will largely pick up where Colonel Pusztai left off by speaking about how these recent technological developments described in our paper have leveled the playing field between the great powers and the medium powers, and how this state of affairs will present certain challenges for the United States as well as our allies. He will draw upon his vast experiences inside the American military and intelligence community to suggest what his former colleagues should be doing to prepare for the road ahead. He'll also share with us some of his blue sky thinking about where things seem to be headed. We'll then turn to Dr. Kitty Harvey. She is former US Naval Intelligence Officer with a forthcoming book on Saudi Arabia and Iraq following the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where she's looked at how Gulf states make their regional foreign policies. She'll share with us some of her MENA expertise explaining how these military developments and their possible future evolution are quite relevant for understanding the ever-expanding Turkey-UAE rivalry, which has played out not only in Libya, but throughout the broader region, from the Qatar crisis all the way down to the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. She'll also comment on how the Biden administration might be affecting the regional equation. Finally, we'll be hearing from Whitney Grispin. She is currently visiting scholar at the George Washington Elliott School of International Affairs Institute for African Studies. Previously, she was an advisor to the Somali Ministry of Defense, and she brings to this topic nearly a decade of experience working for a private firm providing UAS operators and maintenance expertise to governmental clients. Whitney will share her thoughts about the changing nature of warfare due to these technological shifts and global collective action problems that have led to the essentially unregulated use of contractors and foreign fighters in certain under-regulated theaters of war, and how this interacts with the technological changes we have been discussing, which essentially globalize otherwise regional conflicts and level the playing field when it comes to access to the tools of aerial warfare. As she presents these issues, she will draw upon her experiences in Somalia and in the UAV sector to share insights about how large, medium, and small powers are able to operate in a range of African theaters. When the panel is done with their intro presentations, I'll try to sum up the takeaway from the speakers and begin posing the audience's questions to try to put these divergent and dynamic perspectives into conversation. So for a most profitable use of those remaining 30 to 40 minutes, I ask you to please submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. You may also call in by phone, or if you're watching the panel in the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. Worded differently, we're very keen to have audience questions. So feel free to ask a question at any time at events@mei.edu or by typing it into the Zoom Q&A feature. I'll be looking at all of the questions and we'll try to factor as many as possible into the discussion. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Colonel Wolfgang Pusztai.
Dear Jason, thank you for your kind introduction. When I graduated from the US National War College in 2007, combat drones were still more or less the monopoly of the United States and Israel. We have discussed, of course, about the risks of proliferation of combat drones to other states and non-state actors. But that time it seemed to be in a distant future. Today we are in this distant future. Today the drones are already there. Recent successful drone wars in Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh make us think about the lessons for drone powers and on how to counter this threat. When mentioning drone powers, I refer to small or mid-sized states comparable to Azerbaijan or Turkey in Libya. Let me have at first a look on the lessons for drone powers on the strategic level. Initially, it is necessary to prepare the ground for a successful drone air campaign. This means it's necessary to assess the real capabilities of your enemy thoroughly and to identify weaknesses and tailor your own capabilities accordingly. Armenia failed this. Armenia prepared for the wrong war, and we know the outcome. Azerbaijan and Turkey assessed the capabilities of Armenia and of Marshal Haftar's Libyan National Army correctly. They were able to procure or to use the right means already available to them to exploit this. So it's important to assess the enemy in the right way to prepare for a drone war. It's also important to assess, and Jason has indicated this already, how far you can escalate the war to remain under the threshold of the intervention of other major powers, which maybe will lead or would lead or could lead to a classic air war, where the drones would be definitely not the superior weapon. Turkey carefully avoided to cross Egypt's red line in Libya. They kept the war in Tripolitania. Azerbaijan did not confront the Russians in the area of Nagorno-Karabakh. There was one exception when a helicopter was shot down. On the other side, it is necessary to have a look on how a credible deterrence against drone wars could look like. This is actually difficult. If we turn the eye to Saudi Arabia was not able to deter the Iranian attack on the oil facilities. Only after an investigation, it became clear who was behind it. Credible deterrence, as this example shows, does not only need suitable capabilities to strike back and the obvious readiness to use them, but also the ability to clearly identify the attacker immediately. And the Saudis were not able to do so. In Libya, I see this red line in works because in the case of airstrikes on Sirte, it would be obvious and it would be clear who is the attacker. Let me have a look on the operational tactical level. At first, about defense, about protecting the deployment of drone assets. You can use political means to deploy your drone assets, exploiting a peacetime like Azerbaijan did, building up the drone force since 2015, or a ceasefire, as Turkey did in Libya. To deploy the drones in Libya, they needed to establish at first a credible and an efficient air defense. They needed to defend against enemy fighters and helicopters. So they've established a relatively modern, sophisticated air defense system, including, quite remarkably and quite unique, air defense frigates. I'll come back to this later on. But if you're about to deploy your drones in the battle zone, immediately next to the front lines, as it was the case in Tripoli, you need to defend your staging areas and drone bases close to the battlefield against long-range artillery. This means you need to prepare for fighting also this kind of threat. On the offensive side, you need to suppress enemy air defense to ensure the freedom of action for your drones. A precondition is to identify the threat, to identify where the air defense systems and the other threats for your own drones are. And after you have identified these threats, there is the necessity to engage them. And Turkey showed how this worked in Libya. They were using long-range artillery with sophisticated targeting system and counter-battery systems. And quite more remarkable, and actually I would say for the first time, they used long-range electronic attack system, namely their Coral system, to jam radars, fire control radars, search radars, and to enable own strikes with less sophisticated drones. Azerbaijan used loitering ammunition, namely Israeli kamikaze drones, to a very successful extent. All this allows to use the drones, also less sophisticated drones, to attack ground targets, which would usually be no match to air defense systems. The next one is about situation awareness. Density of advanced sensors for situation awareness was a key to success for Azerbaijan. They used drones in an extensive way for persistent aerial surveillance, targeting and fire control for artillery. Actually, this aerial surveillance, permanent aerial surveillance, limited the impact of the fog of war. Let me have a look on how to counter the drone threat. Frequently it is stated that legacy air defense systems are useless against drones. Well, I would say this depends on the drones. Emirati wing-long drones built in China were shot down by legacy SM-1 surface-to-air missiles from Turkish former US Perry-class frigates. These missiles are from the 1960s. The wing-long drones are comparable with the American Predators. So how sufficient are current state-of-the-art air defense systems? Russian Pantsir S-1 short-range air defense system shot down an American MQ-9 Reaper drone over Tripoli, and probably also an Italian one. They massacred the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 combat drones in 2019. And, quite interesting, when the Coral came into the game, they became an easy prey to the same drones in 2020, after the Turkish Coral long-range electronic attack systems neutralized their radar. Advanced Russian air defense systems, including the S-300 SAM system, were no match for the Israeli Harop kamikaze drones in Azerbaijan. They wiped them out within the first 2 weeks of the conflict. And the problem is also here for Western systems, air defense systems. Modern US Patriots, French Crotale missiles, and Swiss Oerlikon 35mm radar-controlled anti-aircraft artillery optimized to combat drones could not protect Saudi key oil processing facilities in September 2019 from Iranian drone and cruise missile strikes. So with regards to killing the target, there is also, of course, the option to jam it. So how sufficient is jamming? This is also depending on the quality of the drones employed. Chinese handheld jammer guns, commercially procured jammer guns, were highly efficient against GNA commercial micro and mini drones, but next to useless against Turkish military drones. More powerful jammers, if we have the capability, can be relatively easily located and attacked, if you have the proper means. But one thing is for sure, The various kinds of jammers, including especially GPS jammers, are a good tool to protect own forces from drone strikes. So what does all of this mean for state actors? Drones are a relatively cheap way for smaller states to have access to limited air power, like the more simple TB2s from Turkey with the limited capabilities and payload. Drones limit the risks of own casualties. Jason has mentioned the significance of this in his introductory statement. They are the weapon of choice for interventions abroad for several countries, including for the United States. Their real effect depends on technology and tactics. Let me state clearly, drones are no Wunderwaffe. They depend on how they are employed and they depend on the technology they have. For non-state actors, for terrorist groups and insurgencies, the access to technology defines the level of threat. From a technical point of view, it is relatively easy to defend against commercial drones, even if they are armed or used for kamikaze attacks, if you have the right sensors to find them and jammers or weapons to destroy them. This is an entirely different story if non-state actors have access to military drones. But even commercial drones are a challenge if they are used in a civilian environment, in larger cities, for example. So this needs to be taken into account. So at the very end, I would like to come briefly to how can the United States and Europe prepare for this future. Actually, we need to say for these already current scenarios. It would be necessary to limit the access to technology for non-state actors and non-friendly states. But this is already difficult because there are too many producing countries, including China and Russia and Iran. A good example for what limiting the access to technology could help is the Bayraktar TB2, the drone from Turkey. This drone is composed of Austrian engines, Canadian optics and sensors, American GPS, other British and German components. If there would be an arms embargo over Turkey, a full entire arms embargo over Turkey, they could not produce any TB2s anymore, and it would be difficult for them to maintain their current fleet. It is necessary to develop proper surveillance systems which are also able to detect targets with a small radar cross-section and low infrared signature. This was the problem for the Armenian air defense with the Israeli Harop kamikaze drones. It is important to continue the development for electronic warfare, including GPS jamming. Maybe in the future, something what is already used in an entirely different way to protect convoys from improvised explosive devices, maybe a similar system could be in the future a tool to protect own ground forces from drones, at least from smaller drones. And at the very end, I would say the key in defending such drones is the capability to attack the whole drone system, not the single drones. This is not about shooting down each and every drone taking off. This is about attacking ground finding and attacking ground control stations and relay stations as they were used in Libya. This is about striking, refueling, and arming points. This is about attacking the takeoff and landing zones and or the launching systems. And this is, of course, also about layered air defense. The challenge will remain in the future, and things will become actually even more difficult with future trends like swarming attacks with mini drones, micro drones. So the challenge is something we need to deal with in the future.
Thank you, Wolfgang. And that was really a tour de force explaining all of the very important technological aspects of how we are living in what would have seemed just 2 decades ago the wildest dream of a future when it comes to the leveling of the playing field and almost democratization of drone warfare by and to many different actors. Now to turn things over to the general to tell us some of his views and lessons. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. It's an honor to be here among my distinguished panelists. And as always, I want to thank the Middle East Institute for inviting me to participate in such an important forum. Retired military officers have a terrible habit of starting any presentation they make with a war story, but I'm going to follow that example anyways, because I do think I have a relevant war story. For those of you that are aware of some of my background, in 2014, when ISIS burst onto the world stage, Mosul had fallen, I was the commander of US Special Operations Forces in the Middle East for Central Command. And unsurprisingly, I got the phone call to get every capability that I possessed back to Iraq immediately, which we then did. And of course, we reconnected with many of our former Iraqi military, law enforcement, and special forces colleagues that we had served with years prior. But here's the point of the story. Very early in our combined operations against the Islamic State, I will never forget getting phone calls and emails from some of my special operators in the field, and they all were basically saying the same thing. Hey, General Nagata, our Iraqi colleagues and we are being attacked by ISIS drones. The Iraqis have no capability to deal with it, and frankly, neither do we. What have you got? And I doubt it will surprise anybody in this audience to know that I didn't have a better answer. So up the chain of command I went, asking for emergency assistance. And if you fast forward to today, here it is many years later, we are only now beginning to field potentially adequate and effective defensive mechanisms if that were to happen again today. We're better than we were. But here is the problem. The requirement keeps changing, or said more directly, the drone capability we're going to be confronted with is improving at a blistering pace. So not only do we have to get better, we have to somehow keep pace with how quickly this technology is changing. So enough of the war story. I think the lessons we can and we should draw from the recent and highly effective combat employments of Turkish unmanned aerial systems that Wolfgang has already described so well are much more profound than just those impressive battlefield effects that they delivered either for GNA forces in Libya or for the Azerbaijanis in their efforts in the Nagorno-Karabakh. These are signposts of a future where the United States and its allies will be increasingly challenged by dazzling high technologies, such as increasingly capable drones that are proliferating across the world at a dizzying pace. We must more strongly grasp that the barriers to entry, the barriers to procurement, and the barriers to employment by any actor, whether state or non-state, regarding these dazzling technologies, all of which can be repurposed for military, intelligence, or even terrorist action, are falling everywhere. Anyone can have these tools, and these tools are becoming more and more powerful at an accelerating rate. It is not a linear rate, it is an accelerating rate. So paradoxically, countries like the United States that have been fundamentally responsible for the spawning of this new digital age where these things are possible, have also failed to keep pace with their adoption in too many arenas. Today's example of the employment of small weaponizable drone technology is simply the most obvious tip of the iceberg, and the remainder of that iceberg should be making us all lose sleep at night. The improvement curve of these kinds of technologies, as well as the certain creation of even more powerful technologies that do not exist today, but will in the near future, again, is not linear, it is exponential. And we have to ask ourselves the question, is the United States or any of its allies today keeping adequate pace? Sadly, at present, I think that the answer must be a resounding no. I know this has been very uplifting, but I want to close by just mentioning some of the things that are either already on the horizon or just beyond the horizon that are not only independently worrisome, but as they converge with each other, as they converge with drone technology, because technologies do tend to converge over time. This is the short list of other things that should be making you lose sleep at night. First of all, on drones themselves, today, the bulk of drone technology is still mostly tied by some sort of electronic tether to a human pilot and emits radio frequency signals. Both of those things are going away. In the future, more and more drones will be autonomous, in other words, dependent on artificial technology, which, by the way, will mean their performance characteristics will improve significantly because human pilots tend to be a limiting factor. And they increasingly will start to emit no RF whatsoever, which will make them exponentially more difficult to detect or intercept. The other things that you should be worrying about that could become integrated with drone technology, one I've already mentioned, artificial intelligence, which already is being married to flying unmanned aerial systems. The so far untapped potential of quantum technology, but the enormous capabilities it can deliver if it becomes operationally practicable for military or intelligence purposes. And the ongoing expansion of increasingly high-speed data services to non-state actors and individuals everywhere that rival anything available to well-endowed nation states. So I didn't come here today to provoke you, but I hope that's been provocative enough. Thanks very much for listening to me.
Thank you, General. I would say that that was a very clear exposition and a sobering reminder of the fact that, as Wolfgang pointed out, the future is here now, and that these technologies evolve and change much faster than our doctrinal attempts to keep up with them or desires to embargo or legislate. And I caught a profound irony there, which is that the British Empire globalized exactly the technologies and capital and ideas and education, which then anti-imperial movements used to bring about the collapse of the British Empire. It was the very spread of education and opening up of the seas and flow of knowledge that allowed those tools to spread. And you pointed out an irony that I didn't realize, and you did so very clearly, which is that America and the American capitalist system's connection to DoD and the American military hegemony produced the information revolution and its military components, and it also brought down the barriers of entry to its spread. And that, of course, had implications for the Arab Spring, for the color revolutions in Eastern Europe, but it also has implications for how data-heavy military technologies are being used and proliferate instantaneously, essentially. So we may have, through the genius of our capitalist system and post-Cold War unipolarity, spread exactly those tools which will end the post-Cold War system and the unipolar world order. And in a way, that's kind of what my forthcoming book is about. I won't put in a plug for it right now, but rather I'll turn things over to Kitty Harvey.
Sorry, still on mute. Thank you, Jason. And I'm delighted to be participating in this panel. I know that I've learned a lot from the speakers so far. It's a really interesting topic. And it was a really interesting report that you and Wolfgang wrote. And so I'm here to speak a little bit about the geopolitical piece of all this. And, if 2019 was dominated in the Middle East by the US-Iran Cold War and the Saudi-Iran Cold War, which of course, culminated in the strike against Abqaiq in September 2019 and the assassination of General Soleimani in just over a year ago. Well, the past year, 2020, was very much dominated by a different rivalry in the region, and that was the rivalry between the United Arab Emirates and Turkey. And of course, Libya was the key flashpoint in that rivalry, and forms the whole backdrop to the really excellent report that you guys have published. And so I just want to touch upon kind of how we got here and kind of the geopolitical aspect of all this, how we got here and kind of maybe where we're going. And so, it wasn't that long ago, though it does sometimes feel like, ancient history, that Turkey and the Gulf states were actually pursuing a historic rapprochement. And that was like in 2005 to kind of 2010, prior to the Arab Spring. Turkey was reorienting away from Europe and towards the Middle East and the Islamic world, is looking to establish new economic partnerships. And, the Gulf, provided, a key opportunity. The Turkey saw the Gulf as, a source of investment and capital. And for the Gulf states, very much led by Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states saw Turkey as a key partner, a key Sunni partner in their efforts to contain Iran. Now, of course, everything changed with the Arab Spring. How long ago that feels. But so everything changed with the Arab Spring. Turkey saw the uprisings that started 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, as an opportunity to create even greater inroads into the Arab world. Of course, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, as the leader of the AKP party, has been a huge champion of political Islam. And this was, you could really see this immediately with, Turkey was a key backer of the revolution in Egypt. Turkey sought to establish, immediate ties with the government, the Muslim Brotherhood government of Mohamed Morsi, that was elected in 2012. Now, on the other side of the equation, the UAE has been the biggest opponent of the Muslim Brotherhood and of political Islam in the region. Whereas the Turkey saw an opportunity, the UAE just saw destabilizing madness. And not only, destabilization, but of course, has seen, political Islam and, popular movements as destabilizing, to monarchies in the Gulf, to, and so, there was a real showdown in Egypt in 2013. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Mohamed Morsi was ousted from power in an Egyptian coup. And that coup, of course, was very much egged on by the Emiratis and the Saudis. And that put Turkey on the back foot. So, the 2013 coup in Egypt was a real turning point in sort of geopolitical alignment. Kind of fast forwarding here, 2016, the coup attempt itself in Turkey was another real turning point in sort of the geopolitical repositioning. There are widespread beliefs in Turkey, whether or not they're based in reality, but there's a widespread belief that that the UAE backed the failed coup attempt in Turkey itself. And so that was, another key moment in the deterioration of the relationship between, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. And then thirdly, the blockade on Qatar. Qatar, of course, has also been a big champion of political Islam and of the Muslim Brotherhood. The UAE and Saudi Arabia, of course, imposed this blockade on Qatar in 2017 that was, really geared towards getting Qatar to cut its ties with the Muslim Brotherhood and a whole range of other demands. Turkey, of course, immediately came to Qatar's assistance. So of course that really kind of cemented the schism between Turkey on the one hand and the UAE together with Egypt and Saudi Arabia on the other hand. And so that's the backdrop for this intervention in Libya in 2019 and 2020. Again, zooming out, it's really a question of shaping, trying to shape the post-Arab Spring regional order. Again, with Turkey seeing political Islam and democratic popular movements as a way for it to project its influence in the region, and the UAE trying to contain all those forces and backing proxies like Khalifa Haftar. So, going to the topic, really our key topic is drones. Drones have made it that much easier. As a panelist, as General Nagata and Wolfgang have pointed out, drones just make it that much easier to intervene abroad. The costs of intervention are very low. And meanwhile, Turkey, UAE and Turkey both have, significant drone capabilities, and Turkey has been a leader now in developing drone capabilities. And so, it just makes it that much easier to intervene and for this rivalry really to play out, really to go from being a Cold War to kind of turning hot. Now, I think that the other factor in the last 4 years has been the permissiveness of the Trump administration. The U.S. really kind of emboldened, the permissiveness that took place with the Trump administration. The UAE and Turkey were very much emboldened to kind of pursue their own courses. And I think that, just forecasting forward for a moment, I think that the Biden administration, Biden and his team have now kind of put all these allies on notice. This Turkey-UAE rivalry, and of course the events in Libya, put the U.S. in a really awkward position, having two key regional partners fighting out this war. The Biden administration has put all these countries on notice. Secretary Blinken has just said in the last couple of days that Turkey's not acting like an ally. The administration is willing to take a greater look at sanctions on Turkey. Just yesterday, of course, the Biden administration has put on freeze the arms package that Trump signed to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia right before Trump left office. And so, I think that if 2020, the UAE-Turkey rivalry turned hot, I think that it may be tamped down, kind of, at least for the foreseeable future. But that said, I mean, this rivalry will continue to be a key feature of the region. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Jason.
Thanks for that. I think if I could summarize, you presented a lucid historical background of the regional component. How did we get to where we are? But then also a Clausewitzian take, which is that obviously war is politics by other means. And when you have these other means and their drones, which decrease the barrier to their use and the ease with which you can make these interferences, the implication is that a big geopolitical regional rivalry like the UAE-Turkey rivalry then can permeate outwards and play out in a range of theaters. And I think that connects us to kind of larger military theory, which shows that, Clausewitz and other scholars are still applicable today as we look at these phenomenon. Now I'd love to hear from our next panelist, Whitney Grispin.
Good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking MEI and my colleagues for this opportunity to discuss such an interesting series of problem sets and the thought exercise regarding what these developments may indicate about events elsewhere in the world. I think that this is a timely discussion with the recent release of the Colonel and Jason's report, and also since Somalia has just seen the 30-year anniversary mark of the start of the civil war there. I'd like to keep my remarks brief because I'm sure that we're going to have a very robust Q&A session. So I'll focus my comments on the impact of foreign contractors and fighters, the current role of air power in Somalia, and then stabilization and security sector reform assistance in Somalia that dovetails with that which has been discussed in the Libyan context. So in framing the presence of contractors and foreign fighters in these theaters, I would assert that contingency contracting firms have been the basis of enabling support to Western militaries across the many theaters of the global war on terror. The majority of contractors in these deployed environments provide life support services, so think food, housing, logistics, but some provide more refined or strategic services like the mentoring and advising of partner nation personnel from the tactical to ministerial levels. So that's a traditional framing of the use of contractors in complex environments, but we're really not seeing a traditional application of that in Libya right now, as was addressed in the Colonel and Jason's report. In addition to wide reporting of Wagner Group presence in Libya, the use of contractors who are Russian nationals is well documented elsewhere across Africa, and there are accusations about the use of less regulated fighting talent having come from Syria and further afield. There are also some important differentiations between contractors and foreign fighters and mercenaries, and we do see all of these types of actors in both Libya and Somalia. However, without getting too far into the weeds, I think that we can say that there's a difference between companies who are contracted by states within frameworks of international law and individuals who are traveling transnationally to fight and are possibly being directed by non-state actors to do so. So for example, there have been recent accusations that Somali citizens are being used as mercenaries in the Tigray conflict. And I think notably, MEI just released a piece yesterday on how Ethiopia's domestic problems risk becoming international, and that's certainly worth a read. However, back to these theaters, I've also seen accusations of Somalis fighting in Yemen and Yemenis enlisting to fight in Libya, plus Syrians going to Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as having heard the disputed assertion that Turkey used contracted support to further their aims in Nagorno-Karabakh as well. So all of this leads to the necessary flag for the ever-present challenges of mitigating the spread of misinformation along these lines, since these are, it's difficult to confirm in these theaters. And I think that the nature of this problem has changed markedly in these environments over the last 15 years, as we know that cell phone coverage has leapfrogged landlines, but it's a critical component in reaching the rural areas of these theaters, where winning the narrative can go a very long way to promote faith in government institutions over the non-state or shadow governance that these adversaries are often trying to assert. So next, I'll go back to the main theme that my colleagues have discussed very interestingly and in detail, to speak briefly about the obvious value of air power in Somalia. Although air power might be a bit of an overstatement in comparison to the Libyan counterpart. So New America has cataloged that at least 20 non-state actors have drone capabilities, with most of them being at the level of hobbyist quadrotors or the like. However, as has been discussed, these commercial off-the-shelf systems have been successfully weaponized, in addition to providing these non-state armed groups with aerial surveillance capabilities, as the Colonel and the General both touched on as well. Given the ISIS affiliate expansion into northern Somalia, as well as extensive press coverage of the relative success of these technological adaptations in Syria and Iraq, I think it's reasonable to expect that these tactics, techniques, and procedures of weaponizing small UAS could expand to Somalia and might be used against both the roughly 20,000 African Mission Union to Somalia troops, as well as the Somali National Security Forces themselves. Entities such as the soon shuttering Asymmetric Warfare Group have prioritized the importance of the ability of forces to counter small UAS, and perhaps have done so under the General's leadership. But overall, I would say, although this is a concern, it's worth noting that I don't think Al-Shabaab and ISIS are exactly getting ready to partner to develop these joint TTPs, as the Somali ISIS affiliate reportedly declared war against Al-Shabaab in December. Shifting gears to bigger platforms, I think that the US's most visible contribution in Somalia has been the provision of air power to the fight against Al-Shabaab. And this is supported by the fact that we have conducted 6 reported airstrikes in the month of January alone. I would also note, though, that war is a human endeavor, and so there's only so much that you can do with air power. You can eliminate the targets, but you can't solve the problems or address the driving factors of these conflicts from 30,000 feet. And so tying back to the broader discussion here, I would also note that this month has seen a Congressional Research Service counter-UAS briefing note, as well as the release of an official DoD counter-small UAS strategy. So this is clearly not a challenge that's not going away in the foreseeable future. And I certainly think that the General made that point more emphatically than any written document can. Lastly, I want to touch on stabilization and security sector reform efforts. There are a number of international stakeholders who are doing significant stabilization and security assistance work in Somalia, from the US with DNAB to the UK's Baidoa Security Training Center to the work of the European Union Training Mission. However, I would note that the Turkish have a footprint and a military training program in Somalia that is well worth remarking on. The Turkish have sponsored hospitals, universities, engineering assistance, and educational exchange opportunities, as well as having their largest embassy in the world in Mogadishu. Perhaps the most visible in the security sector, though, is the 400-hectare training base called Turksam, which reportedly cost about $50 million and was built in Mogadishu. It opened in 2017 and is Turkey's largest overseas military base. I'll wrap this up by saying that I think both Libyan and Somali government actors appreciate the value of security sector reform to their credibility and legitimacy as providers of state services, and they seem to be focusing on these efforts since the provision of security currently rests, the provision of security within their borders is resting significantly on foreign forces right now. So I think that there are a lot of interesting strings to pull at here. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Jason.
Thank you for that, Whitney. If Kitty presented a regional picture, I would say we've just heard from Whitney a kind of case study of how some of these dynamics play out in a specific case. And in a way, getting at larger military theories, which is that war doesn't happen in an isolated fashion. Rather, the human component and how drone warfare ties into issues of hearts and minds and the human factor, kind of Van Creveeldian as well as Clausewitzian aspect there. So rather than my tossing out the first question, as I usually would do, I just want to say that we've heard from Colonel Pustai, General Nagata, Dr. Harvey, and Ms. Grispin by commenting on all the challenges that the Biden administration, the UN, and the EU will have on their plate, as technological changes are clearly happening faster than our ability or major powers' ability to evolve their doctrines to keep up, or the ability of governments to regulate the battle space, or the UN to impose embargoes, or countries to pass legislation, or diplomatically work with their partners to adapt to these challenges. We've also heard a theme which has stretched together, which is that military struggles that used to be confined to one theater or region, as Kitty pointed out, are now being played out in multiple venues globally because the barriers to entry are so low to project military force into other theaters. So we would, of course, expect reversals and surprises in the evolution of how these new technologies and strategic doctrines will play out in the conflicts of the new decade. So to turn to some audience questions, the one that jumped out at me first comes from my colleague at the UN, Mike Shaw. Thank you, Mike, for asking this. And he says, is it possible to have an arms embargo on the components of drones, if not on the drones themselves? And how would such an embargo be enforced? Because if you look at the arms embargo over Libya, that's been a joke. It's meant nothing. And it wasn't just that it couldn't be enforced. None of the major powers even did anything when they saw the Emiratis or Turks violating the embargo. So I'll say first, in response to Mike's question, you need a political will to have an embargo. Merely having a law or a UNSCR isn't going to be good enough because people will try to violate it, and you need the will to confront them either with sanctions or with bilateral penalties or, in extremis with military action. And therefore the Libya embargo was an embargo on paper only because it lacked behind it the will of a unified international community to do something. And this gets at the larger point of our discussion, which is that if medium powers are willing to use these technologies that we've discussed and major powers are not willing to retaliate or prevent them, what does that mean? So to come back to the question, I'd like to ask Wolfgang first, because you know some of these technical things. How would you envision something like an embargo on drone components? And what might that look like? How might that be enforced?
Well, this depends, of course, on the drone we are talking about. But if we take the Turkish TB2 as an example, because Turkey was also mentioned in one of the other questions, and what could the US do about it? Such an embargo should be also about dual-use items. For example, the Austrian Rotax engine, which is used for the TB2, is a dual-use asset because it's also used for civilian aircraft. So it needs to cover also dual-use items. And with regard to the example of the TB2, it's rather easy because all the equipment they are using coming outside from Turkey comes either from the United States, from Canada, from UK, or from the European Union. And I'm pretty sure if there is a resolution or a common decision, that no company in the United States or in Canada or in the European Union would dare to break it. And they would be subject to the law. So if we are talking about this example, it's a rather easy one. If we are talking about components for other drones coming from China, I doubt that it is realistic to block this. So it always depends on the drone and who is the supplier. With the TB2, it could work. With other drones, drones from Iran, probably not.
So thanks for that kind of technical explanation about how the embargo might play out in the Turkey-Libya case. Maybe Whitney can tell us something about the ban in Somalia.
Yes, so I agree that this very much comes down to border control and import-export oversight, but I would note that in August of 2020, the UNSCR did issue a component ban for IED, or improvised explosive device precursor elements. Unfortunately, a lot of those precursor elements are dual use for commercial and agricultural use as well, but that could potentially be perhaps sorry, need a cup of coffee here, a framework that could be worked off of.
Cool, well, I'll step in to try to help you there. Why don't we add to this question before turning to either Kitty or the general? We have from Dustin Jassim, who says, talking about sanctions, Secretary Anthony Blinken announced the S-400 sanctions might not be enough, and he'd like to consider further steps. You mentioned those sanctions, Kitty. What might those further steps be? And are there things that the new Biden administration can do to kind of take away from the chaos that was promoted by the hands-off approach of the previous administration? You're on mute, Kitty.
Sorry, I'm on mute again. So the Trump administration in December, sort of under real pressure from Congress, did place sanctions on Turkey, but they were very limited sanctions. I think that they're very limited sanctions. They're sort of toothless, more symbolic than anything else. I mean, I think that the Trump administration being forced to act by Congress, kind of punted this. I won't kind of elaborate on what exactly the Biden administration can do. I'm not a sanctions expert. But I think there's wide latitude for the Biden administration to consider greater sanctions on to consider greater sanctions than kind of symbolic ones that Trump implemented.
I would agree with you there. And to turn to the general on any of these themes and fold in a question from John Traun, when you mentioned quantum technologies, what exactly were you referring to? And what are your thoughts as someone who's worked in this space about how embargoes and UN legislations and US policy can affect the proliferation of these technologies to non-state actors?
Thank you. I'll try to take these things in the order they arrived. First, I'll return to your previous question about the ability to regulate or somehow control, or even where necessary, embargo either unmanned aerial systems or their components. Personally, I think the toothpaste is out of the tube. Perhaps there are some things we can do on the margins, and if so, we should probably do them. But I think we need to manage our own expectations about our ability to control or regulate something that is both so commercially attractive. I mean, you think about all the delivery services like Amazon that they're basing their future strategies on the ability to use unmanned aerial system to deliver packages. And there's lots of other examples. Everything from construction to medical science to what have you are increasingly looking to unmanned aerial systems to do their business or exercise their profession. And that I don't think there is a way to somehow segregate or separate legitimate, lawful, commercial use of this technology from all the bad people in the world. I mean, this, at the risk of using a bad historical analogy, I think Europe became aware of gunpowder in like the 12th century, you know, there were probably people back then saying, oh, this stuff is dangerous. We need to somehow prevent or regulate its distribution. That it was a fantasy then, it's probably a fantasy now. This is with us forever. And in fact, it's only going to become a more prominent part of our lives for both good and bad reasons. Regarding sanctions on Turkey, I am a skeptic. I will freely admit this. We need Turkey. The United States needs Turkey. We need Turkey against a resurgent Russia. We need Turkey as part of NATO. We need Turkey because of our interests in the Middle East. You know, we've got a bad relationship with Turkey right now, but that doesn't mean we don't need Turkey. We're going to have to find a way to mend fences one of these days. And I think that day is coming sooner rather than later. And besides, Turkey's got a lot of other options from the United States. They've made a lot of friends in the last few years, particularly because of their demonstrated success. And then lastly, on quantum, okay, I am anything but a theoretical physicist. I can't even balance my checkbook, but here's what I do think I know. Probably the most well-known operational utilization of quantum technology, if somebody can make it work. And right now, the Chinese are the class in the field in experimenting with this technology, is to create literally unbreakable encryption, which has never existed before. But if quantum technology can be operationalized, you can have encrypted data that absolutely no one will ever penetrate. It is literally impossible. Another one, it's going to sound like science fiction, but I've talked to some technologists recently who've told me this, and actually this could end up applying to unmanned aerial systems. If quantum technology can be operationalized, as ridiculous as it sounds, you can have a sensor, like a camera or a collection device somewhere on the planet, and a receiver to harvest data from that sensor somewhere else on the planet, and there is no electronic connection between the two of them. It happens through the magic of quantum mechanics. You can see an image, you can see a signal, even though there's no actual connection between the sensor and the receiver. Talk about a game changer for military purposes. Nobody can make this work right now, but what should scare us is that we're not the leader in this field. The Chinese are.
Well, on that very frightening note, I want to just draw on your Turkey point here, because we've had some good questions about both Turkish policy and role in Nagorno-Karabakh. So to frame those questions, obviously Turkey has been an ally of the US for more than 7 decades, and we might be at the most fraught moment of that US-Turkish relationship right now. But as has been pointed out, the Biden administration comes in with a new slate and doesn't have the baggage of having to carry such deep ties to the Emirati and Saudi relationship, which has so soured our relationships and ability to coordinate with Turkey. So I hope, as you have pointed out, that reset with Turkey could be used for things like containing Russia and other shared interests. So to turn to Karen Karapetyan, she writes, are you sure that no foreign fighters from Turkey were in Nagorno-Karabakh? We saw a lot of evidence that Turkish fighters were there and supporting Azerbaijan. So my response, Karen, is that obviously there were a range of mercenaries on both sides, probably Syrian mercenaries, pro-Assad ones on one side and anti-Assad ones on the other, just like in Libya. And no doubt there would have been the Turkish general staff helping out the Azeris. And what I wanted to comment here is that you don't need to have Turkish mercenaries in Libya or Nagorno-Karabakh when you have an extraterritorial war. Because in extraterritorial war, the Turks pass a resolution in the Turkish parliament saying it's okay for the Turkish military to support the GNA, and then they just dispatch the top military brass. And what I wanted to point out here is that that's much more effective than mercenaries. Mercenaries are retired people who never trained together, and they may not have access to the top kit. But when you have a NATO power deploying some of their best minds and tactical geniuses, you get the kind of outcome that we saw in Libya where they win. And clearly the Turkish connection to the Azeris is out in the open. It's not mercenaries. So now building on that, Keith Golder says, with Turkey's recent successes in Nagorno-Karabakh and Libya, as well as its growing competency in counter PKK operations in northern Iraq, what do you expect to see with Turkey's operations in Syria, both in Idlib and along with the security mechanism along the Syrian border? So that's a kind of, how does all of this apply to Syria? So would you like to go with that first, Wolfgang, or should we go back to the general?
And let me start with Azerbaijan and Turkey. Please be aware, only about 20 drones, only about 20 combat drones were from Turkish origin. Hundreds of other drones were coming from Israel, So the backbone of the Azerbaijani victory against Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh was certainly the Israeli drone technology and not the Turkish TB2s. They were only used in the second wave. With regard to Turkey, certainly the interest of this, it's in the interest of the United States and also of Europe that Turkey remains stable. There is no doubt about it. With regard to the relations between Turkey and Russia, I'm not sure that Turkey is the proper country to contain Russia. Usually in Syria, in Azerbaijan, and in Libya, they're making deals with each other. So I agree with the general that it would be necessary to frame Turkey a little bit and to get them back on track. And this means Turkey could be hit where it hurts them right now most. The premier tool for their foreign policy is currently their military. They're using their military in Africa, in Syria, in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, and so on and so on. And this could be really hit hard by sanctions. I don't think that the United States can accept that they are using the S-400 missiles, the Russian ones, while procuring the Joint Strike Fighter. This would most likely undermine the efficiency of the whole Joint Strike Fighter fleet. If Russia gets access through Turkey, and I'm not sure that one can control what the radar systems are sending over to Russia, if they are getting data about how to detect the Joint Strike Fighter, the United States would be in real troubles. So yes, it is necessary to deal with Turkey in a proper way. Yes, it is necessary not to undermine the stability of this country. And yes, it's an important partner for Europe and for the United States. But it's necessary to get them back on track.
So to add in another question and then turn over to the general, we have Michael Shaw responding to our fielding his question saying, do you feel that Turkey is becoming more extreme, that maybe as they're competent in gaining all those allies that you mentioned about, they're falling into a kind of neo-Ottomanism that we hear about and their traditional desire to oppose Russian Empire? And where do we see the historical precedents here and things playing out more in the Eastern Mediterranean regionally? And to toss in a tactical question, Paris Michaels has asked, do any of the guests feel that Turkish drone installations in Cyprus create an imbalance and instability in the Eastern Med? Is there any global forum monitoring Turkey's otherwise power projection into Cyprus? And doesn't Erdogan exploit the lack of treaty consent to extend Turkish advantage in the Eastern Mediterranean? What risks does this pose to the European Union? Lots and lots of questions coming in about Turkey. So I'm going to say that I'll just open things up for everyone to say their thoughts about Turkey, and then we're going to move on to non-Turkey questions because we have 20 more minutes left. General.
Okay. Gosh, where to start? I'm going to go back to what you were saying at the very outset of your most recent comments. This increasingly complex array of, whether you call them mercenaries or foreign fighters or contractors. There are several other terms I've heard bandied about over the last couple of years. I think what all of this can occasionally distract us from, at least in my view, is I think I'm watching the entire world return to a high technology version of one of the oldest forms of conflict known to man, and that's called proxy warfare. Whether it's the Wagner Group or it's, Central and South Asian foreign fighters that have been lured from their homes to go fight in Syria, or what is happening in Somalia, it doesn't really matter. These are all proxies. And the reason it's coming back with such a vengeance is because proxies are so much more capable now than they once were, for all the reasons we talked to at the beginning of this conversation today. The barriers to obtaining incredibly powerful technology are falling away at record speed. And so anyone that has the desire to employ a very powerful technology increasingly can do so, which makes the classic attractiveness of proxies. It's very useful to have somebody else do your bleeding and your dying for you. Much more attractive, because while they're bleeding and dying for you, they're going to accomplish what you want them to accomplish so much more effectively and so much more quickly. This is a reality I'm seeing everywhere, but frankly, inside the United States and some of the developed world, we're being very slow to realize this, and you cannot solve a problem if you do not know you have the problem.
To build on this point, you could say that we're in a post-Westphalian moment, but the key way to contextualize it is that Westphalia was a brief period from 1648, maybe only to 1945. In other words, before 1648, non-state actors deployed force in a very effective fashion in European and non-European wars.
Yep.
And the use of mercenaries rather than conventional armies was an accepted and widespread practice that was used for victory. And the rise of conventional, the Clausewitzian Trinity, is a relatively new phenomenon, and there was no rule that was going to have to continue. And so since 1945, we've seen it eviscerated. And maybe what we're speaking about is that drones and different operational doctrines are seeing this post-Westphalian use of force happen more rapidly. So now I'm going to turn to Andrew Scott, who asks, could some of the speakers please address the potential for and defense capabilities against non-state or state-based actors hacking either current drone-piloted drones or AI-based UAVs within greater power airspaces? And I'm going to turn right back to you because you're already up. You were speaking about the ability of a kind of neural net of artificial intelligence just piloting drones directly. And I was terrified to hear that because I have heard about it, but I don't know much about it. And I know from some of my work in other domains that as soon as neural nets are involved, the computers become better at the activity than humans could ever be. And first it was backgammon, then it was chess with Deep Blue, and now it's even in Go. And Go was seen as the strategic frontier of games that computers would not be able to be better than humans. So soon we'll find out that artificial intelligence will be much, much better at piloting these drones than humans. So I toss that back.
Yeah, I'll be very quick because I want to give the other panelists an opportunity to weigh in on so much of this. But if it's frightening, it should be. The trillions of dollars globally that are being invested commercially to develop ever more powerful artificial intelligence they're all going to be employed in things like drones and other forms of robotics, things that fly through the air, things that crawl on the ground, things that swim through the sea. They're all increasingly going to be employed by humans, but not controlled by humans, because their performance, their endurance, their range, their capacity, their capability will be so much better without the limitations of human physiology and the speed of human cognitive thought. This is just the way it is. There is no putting this genie back in the bottle. This is our future. Now we can either grasp it, understand it, and learn to use it despite its risks to protect our own interests, or we can be victims of it. Right now, there's an argument that can be made we're on the path towards being a victim of it.
Well, very well put. And Whitney, all the different topics that are out here, I want to add yet another question from Doug Brooks. In terms of US air power airstrikes in Somalia, have these mostly been drones or conventional aircraft? And has the US seen any attempts to counter drone operations there? So feel free to address that as well as the range of other topics that are floating about in the ether.
Great, thanks so much, Doug. Nice to hear from you. Really interesting question. I think that there's been a sufficient amount of public reporting on the different platforms that are being used and where they're being based from to counter these networks in Somalia. And I am not privy to any information that would indicate that Al-Shabaab has a technological ability to counter or interfere with such operations. Also, as a hat tip to Doug, who is the president emeritus of the International Stability Operations Association, I wanted to take a moment to answer one of the other questions that I saw about the difference between mercenaries, contractors, and foreign fighters.
Thank you.
So, I mean, there's a great body of scholarship on this by Dr. Chris Kinsey, Dr. Deborah Avant, Dr. David Mallet, but I would pin this down and say that if you look first at the Geneva Convention, right, Article 47 defines mercenaries as combatants who are neither nationals nor residents of the territory controlled. They're not members of the armed forces of a party to the conflict, and they are not sent by a third-party state on official duty as a member of its armed forces. If you look at foreign fighters, they are non-citizens of conflict states who join insurgencies during civil conflict, often for ideological reasons, but obviously the drivers are as diverse as the individuals. And lastly, I would say that contractors, the important thing to keep in mind here is that they are licensed by the states, and in nearly all cases are contracted by state governments, not non-state armed groups. I think that the report also brought up a really interesting phenomenon through the militias and the VOA movement, which maybe you can speak to a bit more, Jason and Wolfgang, but sort of how other non-state armed groups and actors are filling voids or kind of falling through the cracks of these frameworks, which means that we in academia might have a bit more to do to flesh out these definitions. I hope that addresses some of those questions. I think
Thank you for folding in the question about how to define mercenaries, extraterritorial actors, and others. Just to bring in some more questions, from Matthew Hawthorne, we have, is there any realistic way to prevent either state or non-state actors from weaponizing commercial drones to carry out political assassinations within cities? Can such an attempt be reliably traced back to the perpetrator? And this ties into another question we have from another attendee. What about political assassinations, Middle Eastern regimes using drones to assassinate their enemies? And that was a really very thought-provoking question, because there has been a history from Gaddafi trying to assassinate the Saudi king to others. So thanks to Abu Qudan for that. And regionally, Kitty, with these regional rivalries being essentially existential, meaning, as you pointed out, that the UAE and Saudi wanted to do anything within their power to get Morsi out of Egypt, and the Qataris want to do whatever they can to make sure that Sisi is now out of Egypt, while the Emiratis want to keep him in. How do you see these kind of more targeted potential use of drones, or are those things whereby even those regimes know that the blowback would be too intense and risk upsetting the apple cart for them, so we're unlikely to see that kind of use of drones for assassination of enemy heads of state?
I'm still on mute, sorry. Yeah, I don't think that we're necessarily going to see attempts to assassinate rival heads of state via drones. And I think that CC is certainly here to stay. I think I don't want to indicate that there's kind of any move afoot that somehow the Turkey Qatar axis that now exists will be able to kind of reverse the tide in Egypt. I think that Sisi is here to stay. I just wanted to actually, there were a couple of questions earlier, about Turkey and neo-Ottomanism. And just sort of briefly, Erdogan, of course, uses a whole lot of, Ottoman kind of, rhetoric, kind of historical rhetoric. I think it's very much, geared towards his domestic base and, his own sort of sense of Turkish historicism, just in the same way that, Iran uses the same rhetoric. I think what really spurs Erdogan, spurs the Turks, what really motivates them, is not so much, recreating the Ottoman Empire, though of course that is, I will say that's a key feature of Emirati and Saudi discourse, is saying that, Turkey is trying to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. But I think, what really motivates Erdogan is, breaking through any sort of isolation. I mean, I think that, you pointed out in your, in the report that what really spurred Turkey to act in Libya was the deals underway, the Eastern Mediterranean gas deals that were underway that excluded Turkey. And so I think that what is really spurring Turkey to act is to not be isolated in the region, either by UAE, Saudi, Egypt, but also Egyptian Greek relations. I think it wants to. And then I wanted to say, in terms of, how quickly this technology is developing. So drones are not my expertise, but I think it is meaningful and hasn't been brought up that the TB2, which was of course, a key feature of the Libya conflict, Turkey wanted to buy drones from Reapers, or was it Predators, from the United States. And the US said no. This was 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I think this is a really key point. I see General Nagata nodding his head. The US said no. And, there was a bright young Turkish PhD student at MIT who said, oh, I know how to make this, to develop this technology. And, his family had, his family background is a weapons manufacturer, an electronic. Anyway, I mean, this bright young MIT PhD student said, well, screw the PhD, I'm going to go home and make drones. And so that's what he did. And he's now, Erdogan's son-in-law, interestingly enough. But so this whole TB2 technology that's been developed, I think that, the Turks say, the US did us a favor by not selling us this technology because we developed our own. And I think that the TB2, I'll defer obviously to Wolfgang, but I think the TB2 is a very capable drone that Turkey is now, selling to its, selling on. So, I mean, I think that to General Nagata's point, about this technology just proliferating and the genie not being put back into the bottle, I think that that's, very much the case. It's not terribly difficult technology to develop.
Jason, can I add to this?
You may.
I'll be very brief. Whether it's the question about Turkey that Kitty just commented on, I think it was something along the lines of, are they becoming more extreme? Or it's just the general question of why are both allies and adversaries making these choices to use things like drones in such potentially dangerous ways? It's a complex array of answers, but I think one needs to be pointed out here. A lot of it has to do with choices the United States makes. And the example Kitty just gave is a very cogent example of that. We decided not to sell them drones, so they went their own way. They didn't stop because we said no. They just found another way to do it, which is utterly rational if you look at it from the Turkish point of view. But there are a lot of things Turkey has done in the last several years that we really don't like. Now, some of it is certainly attributable to Erdogan's personality, or just, sometimes allies and partners do things you don't want them to do. But we have to consider how much of this happened because of the way we treat them and the way we talk about them and the way we talk to them. It's not irrelevant. And then finally, more broadly, on this larger question of why are so many organizations, why are so many allies and partners, why are so many adversaries going down this road? Well, the obvious reason is because it's so lucrative and it makes you so powerful. But there's another reason, particularly in places like North Africa, the Middle East, Central and South Asia. Those countries are taking a hard look at the United States and asking themselves this question: is the United States leaving? I mean, is a country that may have been a very large guarantor of my security and my survival, are they leaving? Because if they're leaving, then I have to turn to other options. And some of those options are things we don't want them to do, but we're removing their own confidence that they can fend for themselves.
Well said. And I think to kind of sum up, I'd like to just take one last question and then turn to the panelists for 1 minute each, to bring together this very disparate and enlightening conversation. So in my summing up, I'll say, we've heard that when the cat is out of the bag, you can't put it back in the bag. And that's obviously true. But then this larger geopolitical lesson, which again goes back to historical parallels like with the British Empire, as soon as the British left India, every tiny country from Africa to elsewhere knows, hey, now it's my moment to have my anti-imperial mobilization because they might be leaving here too. So there is a bandwagoning effect that as we have withdrawn from certain theaters and power A has gotten away with something, well, then I want to get away with it too. So I'm going to make my drones. And then we heard the point from Nils that connected to what Nilsu said in our last panel, which is that because we sanctioned the Turks, they just made their own drone capabilities. So I've spoken too much. I want to put in the question from Jay Takachuk. In your opinion, is the Nagorno-Karabakh experience relevant to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and how? I think it's extremely relevant. And I wanted to have that be the last question, because in my mind, it was that Obama didn't enforce the red line over Syria when chemical weapons were used there, that Putin felt he could annex Crimea and get away with it. So as soon as a red line is breached, it motivates others to try to breach it as well. So to toss that in for your final remarks, could we go in the reverse order of how everyone spoke? So that means you first, Whitney.
Thank you. Sorry, I just had to take myself off mute there. I think that particular question was maybe a bit more targeted towards the other panelists, but I will address a quick one about—
Just your general concluding thoughts are fine.
Okay. Regarding the question of the assassinations in urban use, I just mentioned that there is geofencing for some small platforms to avoid their entry into certain airspace. So it exists, but it's very imperfect. So I don't think that really hits that nail on the head. I think that the Colonel is 100% right, that you have to defeat the UAS, which is the system, rather than just the UAV, which is the platform, the vehicle, right? So it has to be the ground control system, it has to be the comms, it has to be a multifaceted defeat. One other thing that I'm surprised didn't come up, but that I'd love to maybe have another panel on down the road, is touching on great power competition. And I just say that Russia isn't the only competitor with security contractors in Africa. China is reported to have over 10,000 security companies. They're reported to have a number of security companies among the 10,000 that they're sponsoring right now. But it's really interesting time, and lots of great things that I learned along the way. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for this opportunity and for the participants and their time.
Thank you for that, Whitney. And I really appreciate that you mentioned China there, because our discussion has so focused on Turkey and the UAE and inter alia Russia, that to talk about this kind of great power competition without mentioning directly China and all of the technological innovations that they're going to bring to play would be remiss. Kitty.
I just want to say I've learned a lot in this discussion, and just to reiterate what you've just concluded, Jason. The cat's out of the bag. It's so easy to intervene via drones, and listening to the other panelists, it's been brought home to me that, boy, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So there we go.
Yeah. Shall I say we're not going to go out of business, those of us who are in the punditry game of this field. And on that, to turn to you, General, for your summing up thoughts.
I'm recognizing there are more than just Americans on this call. I want to reflect that in my closing remarks. America and its allies and friends around the world have a reckoning coming, but we can choose the form of the reckoning. The reckoning I hope we have is that we grasp the fact that we better pick up our game when it comes to both understanding, embracing, and adjusting ourselves, including our very bureaucratic decision-making process, to adopting and employing lawfully, ethically, legally, these increasingly powerful technologies. That will be very difficult, be very complex. It will force us to make organization and cultural and political changes we really don't want to make. But if we don't, then all the people who don't like us are going to adopt these technologies more quickly and more effectively than we are. I don't know that I would go so far as to say that I can foresee the ending of the Westphalian state system, but we may find ourselves on a hilltop someday where we can see the end of the Westphalian state system in the distance if we don't start making better choices. Thanks.
Well, that lights the fire under our legs here, because of course, necessity is the mother of invention, and the necessity has presented itself. So it's the task for the Biden administration and our NATO allies and the EU to figure out better ways to have collective action to try to help us live in a more stable and prosperous world. Wolfgang, your concluding remarks.
I would like to highlight that containing the proliferation of drones is difficult and actually next to impossible. Cheap and relatively simple drones like the TB2 or Iranian drones are a big threat. Even commercial drones are an increasing threat. So, in a nutshell, from my point of view, it is important to develop new technology to counter drones in an efficient way. And this new technology should be kept out from the wrong hands.
Awesome. So I want to thank all the panelists for what I think was actually the most engaging panel I've ever done, not live, but on Zoom. And I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too in the audience. And thanks to MEI for putting this together. And oh my God, we even went over the hour and a half that they generously gave us. So good afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone. Bye.